All right, we've got episode 101 of the Church Digital podcast, powered once again by Stadia Church Planting. It's kind of nice. We're in three figures now, 101. We celebrated episode 100 last week. Phenomenal episode, packed guest list. And so lots of content there to process and celebrations to be a part of. Listening audience, thank you. But let's move on to what's ahead. Hey, we launched a new show here at the Church Digital. It's called Beta, the Beta Show. And so we are answering your questions. The show debuts on social media Wednesday. We put it on podcast Thursday. And so check it out, the Beta Show. There's information at thechurch.digital on it. Or really, what I'd love, what you can do right now for me, listening audience out there, text me questions. What do you have on social media? What do you have? What questions do you have right now in your church in online ministry? What are you struggling with? What's the biggest challenge to overcome? Let me know. Text us 484-324-8724. If you speak telephone alphabet, that's number 4, the church, 484-324-8724. We'd love to get those questions, and we may even answer them here on the Beta Show, one of the episodes we have coming up in the coming weeks. Let's segue. Let's get back to 101 here. I love this episode. I love this man. I'm not ashamed to say it. Jim Tomberlin, Chief of Staff, Christ Fellowship Miami, Multisite Solutions, Unstuck Group. Jim Tomberlin impacted my life before I even breathed the same air molecules, before I even was in the same room with him. As one of the early pioneers of Multisite Solutions, of Multisite Church, one of these OG guys in the Multisite movement, Jim was really pioneering in some areas and really experimenting with this new idea of multi-site church, maybe 20 years ago, maybe even previous to that. And from afar, I loved watching some of his mind space that he was sharing back in the day on Twitter, before Twitter was like the minefield it is now, when he was blogging, back when blogging was cool, when he was generating all of this content, helping churches go multi-site. And at another level, I got to tell you, as I've shifted into this new role here with Stadia and even the Church Digital before then, helping churches go phygital, helping churches go online, it's been a phenomenal relationship. And just to have honestly, a mentor like Jim. We're not engaging all the time, but when we do talk, it's phenomenal, the insight that we get out of it. So of course, 101, I'm like, hey, let's get Jim back in the show here and let's talk about some things. Multi-site church, mergers, digital church, phygital church. Where are we going with all this thing? Jim, what are you thinking? And so we're bringing into this conversation, we're bringing in Jim Tomberlin, Multisite Solutions, Multisite guy, Chief of Staff with Christ Fellowship Miami, Unstuck Group, so many hats. We're bringing in Ray DeArmas, Digital Pastor, Christ Fellowship Miami, co-host here, of course, bringing in myself, Jeff with the Church Digital, and Stadia Church Planting. In an episode here, 101, that I'm really simply calling the key to the next digital church frontier. Okay, everybody, here you go.
Hey, well, it's great to be back with you, Jeff and Ray. Appreciate how you are leading in this whole digital church movement. And it's not new to you. It's been, 5+7 years maybe that you really led Christ Fellowship into the digital space. And we've been building on that ever since. So, and your podcasts are riveting. And you guys are becoming the voice, one of the key voices in this digital church movement. But my background, hey, I'm in my 4+ decade of being in pastoral church work and still loving it. And I get the chance now to help other churches after the last 15 years as a consultant in the multi-site merger movements. And that's what led me here to Christ Fellowship as a consultant, and now serving as a chief of staff for the last 3 years. It was supposed to be 6 months, but 3 years later plus. Still in this game here at Christ Fellowship and following behind you guys in terms of the work you've been doing in the digital church space.
That's awesome. Let's just even back up. You're in your 4+ decade. What's the secret to that? I don't know. I look around, I see people getting burned out. I see people getting alienated with ministry. 4 decades. So that's what, since the 80s? What's the secret to that?
Even a little before that. So, but I don't know. I think I've never fully recovered from the redemption and that I experienced in Christ as a teenager, and I'm just so grateful to get to do what I do. I feel real strong sense of calling. I have an incredible wife who has that same sense of calling as well. And we've just been able to love the church in spite of all of its humanity. And of course, that's what the Bible teaches us, that, humanity is broken and in need of forgiveness and redemption. And so churches are full of broken people who need forgiveness and redemption. And I'm just glad to be a part of that process in my own life and helping others in their journey as well. And I still believe the local church is the hope of the world, and have given my life to the greatest message and purpose that I think a person can give their life to. So I'm still grateful to be serving and being able to bring hopefully some help to some folks along the way and in the work of the church.
Man, hopefully that's inspirational. Just even for me, a guy who's done 15 years of church staff, and I joke here on the show, like I've never stayed at any one location longer than 5 years before it's like, okay, it's time to go and just kind of move on. Somebody like you, and yeah, you've had different roles in different parts, but for 40 years on physical church staffs, outside through your organization, supporting church staffs from within, consulting, being part of that. Honestly, just me looking from the outside, that's inspirational to see somebody who's dedicated 40 years of their life to the church. So, even up front, hey, thanks for the service of that. Thanks for contributing. Thanks for helping the bride of Christ in this season. And thanks for investing. Even Jim, like you were influential in my life before you and I even met. Through Multisite Guy, through Multisite Solutions blogs back in the day, and just really being one of those loud voices. I want to thank you, and we've had this conversation before, because even before I knew you, I felt like I knew you, and you were having ministry influence on my life. So thanks for that, even up front. Which is why I love having conversations like this, because, I'm listening to you on a Carey Nieuwhof podcast and you say the word phygital and I'm screaming up and down, yes, yes, yes. Like he's got it. And he said it on Carey Nieuwhof, and we're getting it out there. And I'm understanding more of like this, COVID's a thing. And as much as we at the church want to go back to February 2020 and pretend like, nothing happened. I don't think we're actually going to be able to go back, because I don't think February 2020 exists anymore in culture. And B, I kind of find it funny that churches want to go back to February 2020, because February 2020 was not a great time in context of ministry. And so you're the Multisite guy, you're the merger guy, and there's books that you've written on this, and I want to have some of those conversations. But I'm just curious, like from a Multisite perspective, what are we learning? What is the church learning mid-COVID, coming out of this post-COVID? Mm-hmm. I'm hearing some rumors that maybe Multisite's dead. I'm seeing some churches that are kind of struggling with this. Like, what's the Multisite perspective now, mid-post-COVID?
It's a great question, Jeff. When this COVID hit us, I went back and reviewed an article I published with Outreach Magazine back in the fall of 2019. And they had asked me to write an article about where the Multisite movement was then and where was it going in the future. So I named a half a dozen trends that I was seeing that that churches that are really getting and effectively doing Multisite, this is what they're doing, and this is where this movement is going. So I went back to see if that was still valid, it is still relevant in light of COVID. And as I read it, I thought, absolutely, even more so. And as I've been said in several different places, and others have said as well, that COVID really hasn't changed anything. It's just accelerated the good, the bad, and the ugly in all dimensions, inside and outside the church. Certainly in the Multisite movement, the trends that we were seeing of effective churches doing Multisite, those have only been accelerated and intensified and magnified through this COVID season. So I could tell you the Multisite movement is not dead or dying, or the idea or the model of it. just was a few weeks ago with a church that's in one location, it's about 2,000, and said, hey, we're ready to multi-site. Can you come and talk to us up in Tennessee? So, I mean, it's not going away. Now, for a lot of churches, and I said this in my article back in the fall, and I just published a new article with Resi, our good friends at Living as One, now Resi, they asked me, could you write an article about multi-site reopenings in multi-site churches? But so I expressed several of the things that we're seeing there in the multi-site church movement. But as we said back in the fall, small is the new big. That smaller facilities is clearly was the trend then, and it continues to be that way. The churches that dabbled in multi-site, with one or two locations, and they saw that as quote like a satellite campus. They still had a main campus mindset. They didn't really make the multi-site paradigm shift. We're going to see a lot of those churches shedding their campuses. We already were seeing that and getting out of the multi-site movement. But those churches that really embraced the multi-site model, the paradigm of one church, multiple locations, and shifted in that paradigm before COVID, they're going to do fine in this season. Those who have a big box model are going to struggle. That is where every campus is a big, huge space facility. It's just not needed with a multi-site model. Mm. Those with a big campus, main campus that they had before they got into the movement, they're going to struggle more about filling those campuses up. But small is the new big. And for those who are nimble and who can embrace the paradigm shift, multi-site is still going to be around and is growing.
Thinking small is a consistent challenge for a lot of churches, right? Just in terms of expectations. How are you encouraging churches to kind of temper those expectations as they move forward?
Well, again, I think before the multi-site movement, the mantra was, let's get as big as we can. And the mega church movement started around the 70s, 80s in America. And but then as we realize you can get so big in one location, you can become unsustainable. And so we clearly came to that conclusion. We're not going to see, and there's been definitely a decline in building larger buildings even before COVID. We just don't need them if you have a multi-site mindset. I was in a church the week of COVID, the week that it hit the country, that mid-March. That Tuesday, I was in a church in Colorado that had moved into a building that they had built and purchased the land and built a building for $6 million. And they were meeting in 5 services in a building of 350 seats, 5 services on Sunday. And when they moved into that building out of a school, they were about 500 3 years ago, and they'd grown to 2,000 people in a building with 350 seats. And it was all Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon meetings, get services. And they were almost apologizing for how small the building was. And I said, why did you build it with only 350 seats? And they said, that's all the county would allow us to build. And so I said, but let me just say this is the new normal. This is before COVID hit. I mean, the week of it. What you've done here proves you can be a mega sized church in a small facility. And so they said, well, we've maximize our space here, and we want a multi-site. And so I was just in that church about a month ago when they had reopened, and they're back in business and looking at down the road for more sites as well as they regain their congregation back. But I think that is the new normal. You don't have to be big facilities to have a big impact. It's not getting as big as you can, but it's getting big enough where you can birth healthy congregations.
Right. Jim, is there a benefit to that? Because as I look to getting back, not everybody's ready to meet with large crowds. And so is there a benefit to thinking small as opposed to thinking large because of it?
Well, that is one of the benefits. We know across the country that the larger churches with larger campuses are having a hard time returning. The megachurch facilities are not filling up. The smaller churches were able to reopen sooner and get back to pretty much business for them. So we saw that here at Christ Fellowship when we reopened 2 weeks ago. Our smaller facilities, locations were, 50 at our capacity of what's allowed for us with social distancing, where our two larger campuses weren't hitting that 25%, or barely hitting the 25% category for us. And so smaller is more nimble and more. The other benefit is it costs a whole lot less to maintain and take care of smaller facilities.
I love this line. Jim, last time you were on the podcast, the line from you was not everybody has to buy into it, but enough have to make it worthwhile. That was the thing. I have said that hundreds of times since you were on the podcast. And this line right here is going to become my next line. It's not get as big as you can. It's get big enough to multiply healthily. Let's unpack that, because in physical church, in digital church, there's reach versus engagement, like that. There's a lot kind of in this one phrase. And so I guess I would kind of say, how do churches see this? Do churches struggle with this? Like, unpack that statement and maybe give some advice or shaping in context of how that applies to the church today.
Well, Jeff, I believe that it's in the DNA of every living thing. God has breathed into every living organism, and I think of the church as a living organism. The breath of life is to be a blessing, to be fruitful, that is, to reproduce, and to multiply. That was the commandment given to Adam and Eve. The Bible says in Genesis that God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply." What that means is for the local church is it's in our DNA to be fruitful, to be a blessing, first of all, to a community and to people's lives, but not just to be a blessing so we can enjoy the blessing, but also to reproduce that. That's being fruitful. And then to not only be reproduction, but multiplication. Now, that being said, I use the analogy of humanity. A 16-year-old can have a baby. A 16-year-old young woman can have a child physically, but is it healthy? Is that wise? 20-plus-year-old woman is in a healthier place to have a healthy baby and survive the delivery. So, I think the same is true for a local church. Our goal is to make disciples. It's not just to do church, but we're the point of the spear of disciple making. The local church is, and so. The goal ought to be, as churches are birthed, is let's reach people, let's make disciples, let's grow, healthy things grow. And so when we get strong enough and healthy enough, we need to reproduce. And then when we birth out other congregations, true multiplication is when those congregations or campuses give birth to campuses. And so that's just in our DNA. And but there is, just like in the human body, there is a healthy time to do that and a premature time for that to happen.
So we're seeing multi-sites and I love this evaluation that you say, if you're going to measure health, don't just measure the Sunday, measure groups, measure multiple levels, because that's going to tell you the health. It's more than just that reach of the Sunday morning nickels and noses, the butts and seats approach. And so kind of have that. And hopefully physical established churches, even mapping that out onto the digital side, don't just map out and celebrate the number of Facebook viewers you have for 2 seconds, but how much of that's getting connected into your next step, your membership classes.
I was going to say that it's not just the followers; it's how many are taking a next step. That's the key.
Yeah.
If nobody's taking a next step, or if you're not even giving them an invitation to take a next step, but even if you are, that's to me is the real evidence that you're connecting with people, that people are really engaging with you. They're not just flipping through the websites.
Yeah, the challenge is to move beyond consumer, and so because we don't want our church online, we don't want our churches to be filled with consumers. We want to get to that next level, and so put metrics on that, measure that, gauge the success of those next steps. Don't just be celebrating the reach number. You can write a check to Facebook or to Google to boost that reach number. You got to figure out how to get them to that next level.
Jeff, I think the churches that are going to be effective in this COVID era and beyond are those that really are going to move away from focusing on the weekend experience, but more to what's our content this week that we're going to put online, that we're going to deliver at our physical campuses, that we're going to funnel through our small groups, and that really it's less about an event. The weekend is a vehicle now, and a very powerful one, but one of several. And I think the focus moves there. What can we put? What's our content for this week or for this 3 months or whatever? And then how do we get that out in different ways digitally? How do we deliver that on the weekends? And so that we start with, in the past, Ray, the idea was, hey, we have our weekend experience. How do we make it digital? Now, I think the shift needs to be, we have content that we start digitally, and then how do we deliver that, contextualize that in a physical location?
Yeah, the idea of previous to COVID, I could see where a lot of ministries were operating siloed. Like the weekend experience may be doing one thing, small groups may or may not be connected to that. Kids and students were often kind of doing their own thing. In this COVID season, with digital kind of rising in influence, I can see where digital becomes this thing that connects all of it together, because we're experiencing those services digital and we're experiencing our small groups digital. So our people are now drinking from the same faucet. And there's an opportunity for us as the church to seamlessly connect those together. I love that. Jim, create one experience, one direction, one track. And whether it's social media that's prepping for the service or the service that's prepping for a deeper conversation in social media, you're moving people solidified in one direction instead of micro-fractional pulling them in all sorts of different places. That's beautiful. I don't think I'd really ever put that together until just now. It's a great opportunity. Well, let's do. I want to talk about mergers a little bit, because you just came out with this book. Actually, it's a re-release, and what a timely re-release, where you've got churches that are trying to, here in this COVID season, we're shutting down. Like, was it Barna? David Kinnaman comes out. 30% of Christians have left the church, mathematically an act of God or radical disciple making, but mathematically they're gone. We are not going to get them back. 20% of churches, Kinnaman saying, are going to shut down in the next 18 months. We've talked about digital strategy being a possibility, but mergers are definitely going to be a thing in the future. And you guys were already re-releasing this book and working towards this book coming out to help churches figure out how to do this merger thing. Jim, tell me about it.
Yeah, it's an incredibly, the timing of this was amazing. Last fall, the publishers came to my co-author and I, Warren Bird, and said, your book has been a steady selling book, but it's in hardback. Could we have your permission to release that in paperback? Because we think it's a growing trend, and we'd like to make it even more accessible to more people. And we said we would be willing to do that if you would allow us to update it. And so we did a survey last fall of nearly 1,000 churches who had gone through a merger in the last 5 to 10 years. And we added 3 more chapters. Everything we wrote in the first book, we didn't have to repent of anything we wrote. Everything we said there that we published 8.5 years ago, where we really gave some language to the merger conversation, and some categories and some tools about how this has gone from a lose-lose to a win-win option for churches. And that was these are more mission-driven versus survival-driven kind of mergers that we were seeing 10 years ago. And so that trend has continued to grow. More and more mergers are happening. 10 years ago, 30% of all multi-site churches were a result of a merger or acquisition of a church building through a merger. At Christ Fellowship, as you know, Ray, we've had 3 mergers here locally and 4 globally. campuses, congregations through mergers. We certainly experienced that. Now, in our latest survey, over 40% of multi-site churches are experiencing, facilities through a merger. But we also saw church planters. 20% of church planters are acquiring a facility through a merger, and we also see that more and more churches are seeing who are looking for a pastor or succession strategy as a merger is becoming more a tool and an option for those kind of churches as well. But the publisher said, we see this is a growing trend, and we'd like to release it next fall. That was a year ago, in the fall of 2020. And so we added 3 more chapters, added a bunch more tools, told more stories, updated some more stories from our first book. And we submitted our final manuscript the month before COVID hit. And once it hit, we asked the publisher, could we have that back and address the COVID issue? And also we wanted to review, has COVID changed anything we wrote? And it didn't. Again, it only accelerated what we already were seeing. There's more churches merging because more churches are struggling. And and they said, well, we're going to, they allowed us to have the book back, the manuscript back. We updated some things related to COVID. And they said, we're only going to release one book this fall, and that's your book.
Wow.
Because it's so timely. So it's Better Together, Making Church Mergers Work, expanded and updated.
That's awesome. We'll include a link in the show notes for that, but it was a great book beforehand. I read version 1 however many years ago, but having it come back out to help churches, I'll be honest, like I've already had some of these hard conversations with churches of, hey, I've lost my space. I was set up and tear down at a school. That's not going to happen. We're not going to go back to the school. Have no idea. We're already disconnected. We've tried the digital thing and we're really not able. We were barely grasping, financially being able to hold on. And I guess my question kind of walking into this is, at what point is it, if I'm a church like this that's struggling today, I've got several different options. I've got the merger route. I've got the digital strategy, become a digital only church for a season until I can get my feet back underneath me. I've got just to hang it up and close it down. Don't worry, like just move on to the next thing. So I've really got like 3 different approaches. It's interesting. You're kind of talking about all 3 at different levels. So how do I know as a lead pastor of a church that's struggling? How do I know what path to go on?
It's a good question. One of the things that we tell churches, how do you know if you're a struggling church or stuck church or strong church? Those are our 3 categories. Right? Your strong churches are merging because they're acquiring facilities and congregations, adopting them because they're growing, they're expanding, they're needing facilities. Stuck churches many times are stuck because they don't know they're stuck. They think because they're meeting their bills and everything's okay. They're not in trouble financially, but they're not reaching people. They're not growing. And some churches are fine with that. They're okay being stuck. Others aren't happy with it and are dissatisfied with that. Then there are those who are struggling. We know that in our work at the Unstuck group we have a category of there's 7 stages of a life cycle of a church. And the downside is about 60% are in maintenance mode, stuck. About 15% are in life preservation. And then about 10% are in life support. That's about 25% of those churches that COVID is only going to accelerate their closing. Now, if you're a church that's not, whatever you measure as a church, whether it's attendance, finances, baptisms, whatever you measure, if those things have been on the downside for more than 2+ years, you're in trouble. You need a turnaround, or you may be too far gone to turn around. You need to close down. Or the nice thing is, with a merger, you have a chance to have a second life, a new chapter, a rebirth.
How do I know what path to choose?
The first thing church leaders need to do is, and the first thing leaders do is define reality. where are we now? Where do we want to go, and how do we get there? And so one of the things we do on the Unstuck website, we have a self-assessment tool that churches can take. We've had over 15,000 churches take the self-assessment tool of their health. And that's where we get our statistics about how many churches are struggling, how many are thriving, et cetera. But so first of all is facts are our friends. Are we going to make it? Do we, even if we can make it financially, and many of the churches that merge are not in trouble financially, but they're stuck. They're not reaching people. They're not making disciples. And we all know that the church should be a prevailing church, and that we exist to make disciples. If we're not making disciples, then we're stuck. Now, but so a good self-assessment is the first step. What are the metrics? What are the things that measure health in your world? That will tell you we need to do something here.
It's a great start. Really, I mean, honestly, humbly evaluate where you are in the path. Is it worth getting connected to somebody else, or even just being broken enough to recognize where you are and that you even need that help? So we'll link to the self-assessment in the show notes. You can get access to that and go through. And the Unstuck group, Tony Morgan and those guys are doing a great work right now, trying to help obviously as many churches in this COVID season. I think all the organizations that were trying to help churches, they're all working overdrive right now, trying to help through that. So, Jim, one of the things that I've loved about you is you're the forward thinking guy. I don't want to say like you're like old, but you've been working for decades. That's awesome. We talked about that earlier, so we'll just pay homage to that. But by thinking, by being the age that you are, you've always been kind of pushing the limits on things. One of the leaders of the Multisite movements, championing this idea of mergers. You've been forward thinking in context of your ministry life. And this is what I think is interesting in this season now is we've got an opportunity to do something different. Some of the things that I've been championing is this idea of a digital only church, a church that doesn't have a physical footprint necessarily. And we've talked with digital only planners like DJ Soto, who's got reaching hundreds of people in virtual reality on multiple campuses. Angela Craig is doing a Facebook church that's in 40 countries, 43 languages, something like that. Jade Earhart's reaching video gamers and discipling them and creating a discipleship movement, growing it into a church digitally using tools like Twitch and Discord. And so this is a forward thinking thing. And so as I talk with people about this idea of a digital only church, I get one of two responses. One is, that is the greatest thing that I've ever heard. It's about time. How can I help? Or the second is, that's borderline heresy. You're going to hell just for the idea. And literally, even in COVID season, it's a true dichotomy. It's either one of those two. I'm just curious, kind of your perspective at this idea of a digital only church, a church without a physical footprint, existing in digital space, held to biblical standards. What's your take? What's your opinion when you look at the future? What role do you see like a digital only church playing?
This conversation is a lot like people were having before COVID, where can you even do a digital campus, digital church experience? There was a lot of debate about that. It's not biblical. It's not meets the requirements of biblical community, et cetera. Nobody's saying that these last 6 months about can it work online. Of course, we've demonstrated, it's been demonstrated, you can be a fully functioning church online. The question about digital only, I think, first of all, that is the only option in parts of the world where it's illegal to meet as Christians, where there's persecution. So for many of those, that is the only way they can do church, is digitally. We know that people perhaps in prisons as well, they can't go to a church service and all that sort of thing, although there are ways to even have a church service in a prison. But I think, is it possible? Yes. Is it only? I think we will see some experiences of individuals who are going to be digital only. That's just going to be their strategy. And I want to just say, go for it. I think that if I was a church planter today, and if I was starting all over, if I was going to start as a church, I would start digitally. And this is basically, and it's so fun because that's what you're working with Stadia. That's what they hired you to do, is to help church planters start churches beginning digitally first, at least. Mm-hmm. And I think mostly with the idea of a physical launch eventually. I think if I was I would do digital church. And then I would get people into small groups, and then maybe once a quarter, we'd rent a facility and all come together, have a church experience. I think that would be the way I would go. It reminds me a lot of the first 3 centuries, where in the most part it was illegal to meet as Christians, to certainly build buildings and all, but they all met somewhere. There was a meeting place somewhere. But it was homes. It was by a riverside. It was in a jail. It was the idea of being a building-centric faith. That's something that's happened over the last hundreds of years, maybe in the West. But we know today that where the church is growing the fastest is in places like Iran, Afghanistan, et cetera. But I'm getting off track. Digital only. I think the jury's still out on that. I think that it's not just about biblical community. I think it's just humanity in general has a need for physical connection. So I think we'll figure out ways to come together. But it won't. But I think there'll be different venues to doing that. But I do think, if I was starting a church today, I would start digital first for sure, and then figure out, how do we deliver digital experience in a physical location? How do we adapt that?
Yeah, I love that challenge. The idea of planting a church digital first and then growing it in physical. Stadia, we're doing that a lot. I can already tell you, success stories of guys.
I loved your podcast with the Nouveau Church.
Nouveau's been doing a great job with that, and it was funny. There was one of the other guys that was on here, Ray Hudson, who's with Ray, forgive me, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on your church name right now, but he just launched. He had been digital. He'd launched early in the middle of the COVID season, and he just coming out of COVID. He just had his first physical services, I think, this past week. He did, and it was at a micro location. It was not in the location he was planning on, but they could have 20 people in the service because of restrictions. And so he launched his first service with first weekend with 6 services, 2 Saturday, 4 Sunday. Preached 15 minutes, shorter worship, was a much more condensed environment. It was basically some of the same content that was done digitally with his online service, just done physically. And so planners are trying to figure out how to mold that. Honestly, he's trying to figure out if he could do 10 services. 10 services as a planner. It's just phenomenal, some of the dedication heading into that. But here's what I know. And Jim, maybe you see this, maybe not. But when I look into now coming out of COVID, I really see where all the models have been jumbled up. I think that people, maybe this isn't a long-term thing, but at least short-term, I think churches are trying to fit into whatever mold they can. And maybe the established model of what any given church was, because of COVID, I think all the playbooks are kind of jumbled, and everybody's just grasping to try to find whatever straw they can to work, which I think opens up an opportunities for things like digital only churches to work and to kind of get defined. because I've got micro churches, I've got phygital, I've got digital only, I've got digital first where I'm having to do this before, I've got digital next where I'm on the verge of shutting down. I'm trying to find somebody to merge with, and digital next really seems to be the solution for me for a season until I can get my legs back under me as a church. It just really seems like as these models get jumbled up, I think there's an opportunity for another model to open up with this idea of, let me recognize digital community as a community that's worthy of a church. So are you, what challenges do you see even as we're looking at all of these different models of what church looks like, and how can digital play a part?
Well, I think this is an exciting era. This allows us, we've got, in some ways, COVID has given us permission to do a lot of experimenting and a lot of trying. I would say right now, Jeff, nobody has, would definitively can say, this is the way to forward. This is the best model. This is the best practices. We're all learning that right now. And so but I think this is a great shakeup for the church because we were stuck and declining, generally speaking. 20% of the churches in America are thriving. We're thriving, and I celebrate that. And many of those are the churches that are very innovative and pioneering and willing to try new things. But I think this season gives us the permission to do that. And ask me a year from now, what's the new normal? What's the new best practices? Again, I think. A lot of how you predict the future is what's working now, and kind of follow that, the implications, project that forward. But right now, COVID has turned everything upside down. But it gives us a huge opportunity and permission to try new models, new methods, new ideas. Yeah. And many of those are going to stick and become the new normal.
Yeah. And even to quote you from last time you were on, not everybody has to buy into it, but enough have to make it worthwhile. So, in this season, experiment, try something new, change the way that you're evaluating to a fuller picture beyond just the reach, start to get into that engagement. Engagement is the new, stat to celebrate, and do that across your entire church, your entire discipleship pathway, engagement pathway, and change the way that you're evaluating your church. It's all beautiful. It all works together.
So Jeff, I'm thinking it was you that coined the phrase phygital church, right?
What's interesting is we could actually probably have that conversation. It's either myself or James Emery White. It was, I stole it from from business, like business is using it.
It was out
Forbes,
there.
I think, was the first place that I saw it. And it was funny. The other day, I was actually trying to scrape back through blog posts to try to find where mine was, and because I know James Emery White's been using it a lot out of his church and his movement with church and culture. And so I'm not sure honestly who predates it, but we were early on in that, and I love that it's now becoming like normal talk. I was watching a sermon of a church of a friend of mine, and some 65-year-old pastors on stage preaching online, talking about how we as a church, we need to think more phygital. And I'm like, I just got a 65-year-old dude to say phygital in a sermon. Like my work here is done. Like this is great. So it has definitely been a great run, and we're not slowing down. I know you 4 decades ongoing. You're not slowing down either as well, and you've been a little inspirational for me. Even just saying, "Hey, I want to be able to keep pressing on in ministry and doing this," and for me to keep up pace with you, I guess that means I'll have to be working in 2040. And Lord knows what the church is going to look like in a couple decades. So that might be an interesting challenge into itself. But hey, Jim, and it's been great hanging out with you today, as always. As we're landing the plane here, any closing thoughts?
You commented about just being forward thinking for 4 decades. I appreciate it. Thank you for that compliment. I do have I've always had this. I wake up every day thinking, how can we do this better? How can we reach more people? How can we make more disciples better and more and better disciples? that has been a driving force for me, or a conviction. And how do we do this better? I get bored when it's routine, even if it's routine successful, because success sometimes can be the greatest inhibitor of greater impact, because we get comfortable with our current success. And so I think all down through the centuries, there have always been innovative church leaders who were willing to experiment, to embrace the latest technology, and leverage it and use it for making more disciples and extending God's kingdom on earth. And so it's fun being in this space, and I'm still loving it, and want to keep doing this until I can't.
Awesome. Love it. So, hey, check out Better Together. The link's in the show notes on the merger. Check out, if you're not following Jim on social media through Multisite Guy and Merger Guru, and whatever the next thing is, Jim will figure it out and find ways to jump on that. So love the influence, Jim, once again, that you've had on my life. So thank you for that. Ray had to step out to go actually do Christ Fellowship work, as known to happen. So Ray's not even on here, but it was great having him on too. For Ray, for Jim, this is Jeff with the Church Digital and Stadia Church Planning. Thanks for joining us on the podcast again, and we'll see you next time here at the show. You all have a good day.